The Collector by Jahn Fowles. Part 3. What I'm trying to say is that it all came unexpected. It started off badly because then I went down at 7:30. I saw her lying by the screen. She'd knocked it over by falling. And I knelt by her, and her hands were like ice. But she was breathing. It was a kind of rasping sigh. Very quick. And when I lifted her back to the bed, she came to. She must have fainted in the night when she'd gone behind the screen. She was cold all over. She began to shiver terribly. And then to sweat more, and she was delirious. She kept on saying to get the doctor, please get the doctor. Sometimes it was general practitioner, GP, GP. She went on, over and over again, like a rhythm. It wasn't her ordinary voice, but what they call sing-song, and she didn't seem to be able to fix her eyes on me. She was silent a while, and then it was Yankee Doodle Dandy. Only the words were all slurred, like she was drunk, and she stopped in the middle. Twice she called Minnie, Minnie, like she thought she was in the next room. It was her sister. And then she started to mumble a lot of names and words, all mixed up with bits of sentence. Then it was she wanted to get up, and I had to stop her. She really struggled. I kept on talking to her, and she would stop a minute, but so soon as I went away to look after the tea, or something, she was off again. Well, I held her up to try to help her to drink the tea, but it made her cough. She turned her head away. She didn't want it. I forgot to say she had nasty yellow pimples, one corner of her lips. And she didn't smell fresh and clean like before. In the end, I got her to take a double dose of the pills. It said on the packet not to exceed the started dose, but I heard once you ought to take twice what they said. They were scarlet to make it too strong for legal reasons. I must have gone down 4 or 5 times that morning. I was that worried. She was awake, but said she wanted nothing. She knew what was what. She shook her head anyhow. At lunch she drank a little tea and then went off to sleep, and I sat out on the corner for outer room. Well, the next time I switched on her light, it was about 5. She was awake. She looked weak, very flushed, but she seemed to know where she was, all right, and who I was. Her eyes followed me quite normally, and I thought she was past the worst. The crisis, as they call it. She had a bit more tea, and then she made me help her behind the screen. She could just about walk, and so I left her a few minutes and came back and helped her back. She lay a while in bed with her eyes open, staring at the ceiling. She had difficulty in getting her breath as usual, and I was going to go away, but she made me stop. She started to talk in a low, hoarse voice. Quite normal, mentally, though. She said, "I've got pneumonia. You must get me a doctor." I said, "You're over the worst. You look much better. I must have penicillin or something." Then she began to cough, and she couldn't breathe, and she certainly sweated terribly. Then she wanted to know what had happened in the night and the morning, and I told her. "Terrible nightmares," she said. Well, I said I'd stay with her all night and that she looked better, and she asked me if I was sure she looked better, and I said she was. I wanted her to be better by then, so I suppose I was seeing things. I promised that if she wasn't well the next day, I would carry her upstairs and get the doctor to come. So then she wanted to go up at once. She even wanted to know the time and when I told her, not thinking. She pointed out it was night and no one would see, but I said none of the rooms or beds were aired. Then she changed. She said, I feel so afraid. I'm going to die. She didn't speak quickly. There were pauses. She said, I've tried to help you. You must try to help me now. I said, of course I would. I sponged her face again, and she seemed to be dropping off, which was what I wanted. But she spoke up again. She said in a loud voice, Daddy? Daddy? Go to sleep, I said. You'll be recovered tomorrow. She began to cry again. It wasn't like ordinary crying. She just lay there with the tears around her eyes, as if she didn't know she was crying. Then suddenly she said, What will you do if I die? I said, You're not going to die. Don't be silly. Will you tell anyone? I'm not going to talk about it, I said. I don't want to die, she said. And then, I don't want to die, again. And a third time. And each time, I said, I don't talk about it. But she didn't seem to hear. Would you go away if I died? I said, You're daft. What would you do with your money? I said, Please, let's talk about something else. But she insisted. After a pause, she was speaking normally, but there were funny gaps, and then she'd suddenly say something again. I said I didn't know. I hadn't thought. I was just humoring her. Leave it to the children, I said. What children? And she said, We collected money for them last term. They eat earth. And then a bit later, we're all such pigs, we deserve to die. So I reckon they pinched the money they should have given it. Well, the next thing she went to sleep, for it must have been 10 minutes. I didn't move. I thought she was well asleep, but suddenly she said, Would you? Again, as if we hadn't stopped talking. Then, Are you there? And she even tried to sit up to see me. Of course I calmed her down, but she was awake again, and she would go on about this fund she had collected for. I gave up trying to say it was all silly. She wasn't going to die, so I said, Yes, I would. But she wasn't, and so on. You promise? Yes. Then she said, Promises. Then, some time after, they eat earth. And she said that 2 or 3 times while I tried to pat her calm. It seemed it really distressed her. The last thing she said was, I forgive you. She was delirious, of course, but I said I was sorry again. You might say things were different from last time. I forgot all she did in the past, and I was sorry for her. I was truly sorry for what I did that other evening, but I wasn't to know she was really ill. It was spilt milk. It was done, and there was the end to it. It was really funny, though, how just when I thought I was really fed up with her, all the old feelings came back. I kept on thinking of mine, nice things. How sometimes we got on well, and all the things she meant to me back home when I had nothing else. All apart from when she took off her clothes and I no longer respected her. That seemed to be unreal. Like we both lost our minds. I mean, her being ill and me nursing seemed more real. I stayed in the outer room like the night before. She was quiet half an hour ago or so. But then she began talking to herself. I said, Are you all right? And she stopped. But then later on she began talking again, or rather muttering, and then she called my name out, really loud. She said she couldn't breathe, and then she brought up a mass of phlegm. It was funny dark brown. I didn't like the look of it at all, but I thought the pills might have colored it. After that, She must have dozed off for an hour or so, but suddenly she began to scream. She couldn't, but she was trying, so, and when I rushed in, she was half out of bed. I don't know what she was trying to do, but she didn't seem to know me, and she fought like a tiger, in spite of being so weak. I really had to fight to lie down again. Then she was in a horrible sweat. Her pajamas were soaked. And when I tried to get the top of to put on new clothes, she started fighting, rolling about as if she was mad, and getting in a worse sweat. I never had a worse night. It was so terrible I can't describe it. She couldn't sleep. I gave her as many sleeping tablets as I dared, but they seemed to not have effect. She would doze off a little while and then she would be in a state again, trying to get out of bed. Once she did before I could get to her and fell to the floor. Sometimes she was in delirium, calling for GP and talking to people who she'd known, I suppose. I didn't mind that so much as long as she lay quiet. I took her temperature. It was over 104 degrees, and I knew she was ill, really ill. Well, just about 5 the next morning, I went up to have a breath of fresh air. It seemed another world out there. And I made up my mind that I would have to get her upstairs and ask a doctor in. I couldn't put it off any longer. I was there about 10 minutes standing in the open door, but then I heard her calling again. She brought up a bit more of the red-brown phlegm, and then she was sick, so I had to get her out of the bed and make it up again while she lay slopped in the chair. It was the way she breathed that was worst. It was so quick and gasping, as if she was panting all the time. The morning, she seemed quieter. She was able to make in what I said. So I told her I was going for the doctor, and she nodded. I consider she understood, though she didn't speak. That night seemed to take all her strength away. She just lay there still. I know I could have gone to the village and phoned or got a doctor, but for obvious reasons I never had dealings there, village gossip being what it is. Anyhow, I was so without sleep I didn't know what I was doing half the time. I was on my own, as always. I had no one to turn to. Well, I went into Lubis, and it was just after 9. Into the first chemist I saw open and asked for the nearest doctor, which the girl told me from the list she had. It was a house in a street I'd never been to. I saw on the door surgery began at 8:30, and I ought to have guessed there would be a lot of people as usual, but for some reason I just saw myself going in and seeing the doctor straight off. I must have looked daft in the room, with all the people looking at me. All the seats were taken, and another young man was standing up. Well, they all seemed to be looking at me. I hadn't the nerve to go straight through to the doctor, so I stood by the wall. If only I could have gone straight in, I'd have done it. Everything would have been all right. It was having to be with all those other people in that room. I hadn't been in a room with other people for a long time. Only in and out of shops. It felt strange, as I say. They all seemed to look at me. The old woman especially wouldn't take her eyes off me. I thought I must look peculiar in some way. I picked a magazine off the table, but of course I didn't read it. Well, I began to think they're all about what would happen. It would be all right for a day or two. The doctor and Em perhaps wouldn't talk, but then I knew what he would say. She must go into hospital. I couldn't look after her properly. And then I thought I might get a nurse in, but she wouldn't be long finding out what happened. Aunt Annie always said nurses were the nosiest barkers of them all. She never could abide people with long noses, and nor could I. The doctor came out just then to call in the next patient. He was a tall man with mustache, and he said, "Next," as if he was sick of seeing all these people. I mean, he sounded really irritated. I don't think it was my imagination. I saw a woman make a face at the one next to her. Then he went back in his room. He came out again, and I could see he was the officer type in the army. They've got no sympathy with you. They just give you orders. You're not their class, and they treat everyone else as if they were dirt. On top of that, this old woman started staring at me again, and she made a hot under the collar. I hadn't slept all night, and I was wrought up, I suppose. Anyhow, I knew I'd had enough, so I turned and walked out and went and sat in the van. It was seeing all those people. It made me see Miranda was the only person in the world I wanted to live with. It made me sick, and the whole damn lot. What I did then was to go to the chemist and say I wanted something for a very bad flu. It was a shop I hadn't been to before. Luckily, there was no one else there, so I could give my story. I said I had a friend who was a peculiar person. They don't believe in doctors. And he had very bad flu, perhaps pneumonia, and we had to give him something secretly. Well, the girl produced the same stuff as I'd bought before and said I wanted penicillin or the other stuff, but she said it had to be on doctor's prescription. Unfortunately, the boss came out that moment, and she went and told him, and he came up and said I must see a doctor and explain the case. I said I'd pay anything, but he just shook his head and said it was against the law. Then he wanted to know if my friend lived locally, and I left before he started nosing any further. I tried 2 other chemists, but they both said the same, and I was scared to ask any more, so I took some medicine and they could tell. A different kind. Then I went back. I could hardly drive. I was so tired. Of course I went down as soon as I got back, and she was lying there breathing away. As soon as she saw me, she began talking. She seemed to think I was someone else because she asked me if I'd seen Louis. I never heard her talk about her before. Luckily, she didn't wait for an answer. She started talking about some modern painter. Then she said she was thirsty. It wasn't sense. Things seemed to come in her head and go. Well, I gave her a drink, and she lay still a while, and she suddenly seemed to get half back into normal. In mind, that is. Because she said, "When will Daddy come?" "You have been?" I lied. It was a white lie. I said he'd be here soon. She said, "Wash my face," and then I did. She said he must see some of that stuff I've brought up. I say she said, but it was all in a whisper. She said she wished she could sleep. "It's a fever," I said, and she nodded. For a bit, she quite understood all I was saying, and no one could believe it, but I decided to go back to Louis to get a doctor. I helped her behind the screen. She was so weak I knew she couldn't run away, so what I decided was I would go up and try to get 2 hours sleep, and then I'd carry her upstairs, and I'd go down to Louis and get another doctorate. I don't know how it happened. I always get up as soon as the alarm sounds. I think I must have reached out and turned it off in my sleep. I don't remember waking up once. Anyway, it was hour. It was 4, not 12:30, when I woke up. Of course, I rushed down to see what had happened. She had pulled all the top clothes off her chest, but luckily it was warm enough. I don't think it mattered then anyway. She was in a terrible fever and she didn't know me, and when I lifted to take her upstairs she tried to struggle and scream, but she was so weak she couldn't. What's more, her coughing stopped, her screaming, and seemed to make her realize where we were. I had a proper job getting her upstairs, but I managed it and put her in the bed in some spare room. I had got it all warmed, where she seemed happier. She didn't say anything. She could air, had made her cough and bring up. Her face was the funny purplish color too. I said the doctor's coming, which she seemed to understand. I stayed a bit to see if she would be all right. I was afraid she might have just the strength to go to the window and attract the attention of anyone passing. I knew she wouldn't really, but I seemed to find reason not to go. I went several times to her open door. She was lying there in the darkness. I could hear her breathing. Sometimes she was muttering. Once she called for me, and I went and stood beside her, and all she could say was, "Doctor, doctor." And I said, "He's coming. Don't worry." And I wiped her face. She couldn't stop sweating. I don't know why I didn't go then. I tried, but I couldn't. I couldn't face the idea of not knowing how she was, of not being able to see her whenever I wanted. I was just like in love with her all over again. And the other thing, all those days I used to think, well, she'll be getting over it a long time. She'll need me. It will be very nice, and when she has turned the corner. I don't know why, I also thought the new room might help. It would make a change. It was like when I had to make Mabel out in her chair. I could always find a dozen reasons to put it off. "You ought to be grateful you have legs to push," Aunt Annie used to say. They knew I didn't like being seen out pushing a chair. But it's in my character. It's how I was made. I can't help it. Time passed. It must have been midnight or more, and I went up to see how she was, to see if she'd drink a cup of tea. And I couldn't get her to answer me. She was breathing faster than ever. It was terrifying, the way she panted. She seemed to catch at the air as if she could never get it fast enough. I shook her, but she seemed asleep, although her eyes were open. Her face was very livid, and she seemed to be staring at something on the ceiling. Well, I felt really frightened. I thought, I'll give her half an hour, and then I must go. I sat by her. I could see that things were definitely worse by the way she was sweating, and her face was terrible. Another thing she did those days were picking at the sheets. Pimples had spread all over both corners of her mouth and lips. Well, at last, having locked her door in case, I set off again to Lewis. I remember I got there just after 1:30. Everything shut up, of course. I went straight to the street where the doctor lived and stopped a bit short of his house. I was just sitting there in the dark, getting ready to go and ring the bell, getting my story straight and so on, when there was a tapping on my window. It was a policeman. It was a very nasty look. I lowered the window, just wondered what you were doing here, he said. Don't tell me it's no parking. Depends what your business is, he said. He had a look at my license and wrote down my number, very deliberate. He was an old man. He can't have any good, or he wouldn't have been a constable still. Well, he said, Do you live here? No, I said. I know you don't, he said. That's why I'm asking, what are you doing here? I haven't done anything, I said. Look in the back, I said, and he did. The old fool. Anyhow, it gave me time to think up a story. I told him I couldn't sleep and I was driving around and then I got lost and I had stopped to look at the map. Well, he didn't believe me, or he didn't look as if he did. He said I should get on home. Well, the result of it all was that I drove away. I couldn't get out with him watching and go to the doctor's door. He'd have smelled the rat once. What I thought I would do was drive home and see if she was worse. As if she was. I'd drive her in the hospital and give a false name and then drive away, and then I'd have to run away and leave the country or something. I couldn't think beyond giving her up. Well, she was on the floor again. She tried to get out of bed, I suppose to go to the bathroom or try to escape. Anyway, I lifted her back to bed. She seemed to be half in a coma. She said some words, but I couldn't make them up. And she didn't understand anything I said. I sat by her almost all night. Some of the time I slept off. Twice I struggled to get out of bed again. It was no good. She hadn't the strength to flee. I said the same old things again. I said the doctor was coming and it seemed to calm her. Once she asked what day it was, and I lied. I said it was Monday. It was Wednesday. And she seemed a bit calmer then, too. She just said Monday, but you could tell it didn't mean anything. It was like her brain was affected, too. I knew she was dying then. I knew all that night. I could have told anyone. I just sat there, listening to her breathing and muttering. She never seemed to sleep properly, and thinking about the way things turned out. Thinking about my rotten life and her life and everything else. Anyone there would see what it was like. I was truly and really in despair, although I say it myself. I couldn't do anything. I wanted to live so. And I couldn't risk getting help. I was beaten. Anyone would have seen it. All those days I knew I would never love another the same. There was only Miranda forever. I knew it then. Another thing was she was the only one who knew I loved her. She knew what I really was, not like anyone else could ever understand. Well, it dawned. The last day came. Strange, it was a beauty. I don't believe there was a cloud all day. One of those cold winter days when there's no wind and the sky is very blue. It seemed specially arranged, most appropriate. Seeing she passed away so peaceful. The last words she spoke were about 10, when she said, I think, the sun. It was coming in the window. And she tried to sit up, but she could not manage it. She never said another word to be understood. She lingered on all the morning and afternoon and went with the sun. Her breathing had got very faint, and just to show what it was like, I even thought she had gone into a sleep at last. I don't know exactly when she died. I know she was breathing about 3:30 when I went downstairs to do a bit of dusting and so on, to take my mind off things. And when I came back about 4, she was gone. She was lying with her head to one side, and it looked awful. Her mouth was open, and her eyes were starting white, like she tried to see out of the window one last time. I felt her, and she was cold, though her body was still warm. I ran and got a mirror. I knew that was the way, and held it over her mouth, but there was no mist. She was dead. Well, I shut her mouth up and got the eyeballs down. I didn't know what to do then. I went and made myself a cup of tea. When it was dark, I got her dead body and carried it down to the cellar. I know you're meant to wash the dead bodies, but I didn't like to. It didn't seem right, so I put her on the bed and combed out her hair and cut a lock. I tried to arrange her face so it had a smile, but I couldn't. Anyway, she looked very peaceful. Then I knelt and said a prayer. The only one I knew, was Our Father. So I said some of that, and God rest her soul. Not that I believe in religion, but it seemed right. Then I went upstairs. I don't know why it was one little thing that I did. You'd think it would be seeing her dead or carrying her down the last time, but it wasn't. It was when I saw her slippers in the room where she was upstairs. I picked them up and suddenly I knew she wouldn't ever wear them again. I wouldn't ever go down and draw the bolts again. Funny, I had still bolted her in though. And none of it would ever happen again. The good or the bad. I suddenly knew she was dead, and that means gone forever. Forever and ever. Those last days I had to be sorry for her, as soon as I knew it wasn't acting. And I forgave her all the other business. Not while she was living, but when I knew she was dead. That was when I finally forgave her. All sorts of nice things came back. I remembered the beginning, the days in the annexe, just seeing her come out of the front door or passing her the other side of the street. And I couldn't understand how it all happened, so that she was there below, dead. It was like a joke mousetrap I once saw. The mouse just went on and things moved. It couldn't ever turn back, but just on and on into clever and cleverer traps until the end. I thought how happy I was. Feelings I had those weeks I never had before and I wouldn't ever have again. The more I thought about it, the worse it seemed. It came to midnight, and I couldn't sleep. I had to have all the lights on. I don't believe in spirits, but it seemed better with the lights. I kept on thinking about her, thinking perhaps it was my fault after all that she did what she did and lost my respect. Then I thought it was her fault. She asked for everything she got. Then I didn't know what to think. My head seemed to go bang, 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 and I knew I couldn't live at Foster's anymore. I wanted to drive away and never come back. I thought I could sell up and go out to Australia, but then there was all the covering up to do first. It was too much. The next thing was I got the police on the brain. I decided the best thing was to go to the police and tell them the lot. I even got my coat on to drive down. I thought I was going mad. I kept on looking in the mirror and trying to see it in my face. I had this horrible idea. I was mad. Everyone else could see it, only I couldn't. I kept remembering how people in Lewis seemed to look at me sometimes, like the people in the doctor's waiting room. They all knew I was mad. It was 2 o'clock. I don't know why. I began to think her being dead was all a mistake. Perhaps she had just been asleep, so I had to go down and make sure. It was horrible. So when I went down in the other cellar, I started imagining things. Like she might step out of the corner with a hatchet. Or she would not be there. Even though the door was bolted, she would have vanished, like in a horror film. She was there, lying there, all in the silence. I touched her. She was so cold that it gave me a shock. I still couldn't understand it was true, how she'd been living only a few hours before, and just a few days back, walking around, drawing, doing her knitting, and now this. Then something moved at the corner end of the cellar, back by the door. It must have been a draught. Something broke in me. I lost my head. I rushed out and fell up the stair in the other cellar and out. I locked the door down double quick and got into the house and locked the door and all the bolts home. After a while, the shaking stopped. I calmed down, but all I could think was how this was the end. I couldn't live with her down there like that. It was then I got the idea. It kept on coming back, this feeling that she was lucky to be done with at all. No more worries, no more hiding, no more things you want to do and won't ever be able to. But finished, the lot. All I had to do was kill myself. Then the others could think what they liked. The people in the waiting room, the annexé people, Aunt Annie and Mabel, all of them. I would be out of it. I started thinking how I could do it. How I could go into Lewis as soon as the shops opened and get a lot of aspros and some flowers. Chrysanthemums were my favorite. Then take the aspros and go down with the flowers and lie beside her. Post a letter, first to police. So they would find us down there together in the great beyond. We would be buried together, like Romeo and Juliet. It would be a real tragedy, not sordid. I would get some proper respect if I did it. If I destroyed the photos, that was all there was. People would see I never did anything nasty to her. It would be truly tragic. I thought it out, and then I went and got the photos and the negatives, all ready to burn first thing in the morning. It was like I had to have it, but I didn't care anymore. Aunt Annie and Mabel would get it. Miranda talked about the Save the Children Fund, but she was already half off her rocker. All those charities are run by crooks. Save the trustees, more like. I wanted what money couldn't buy. If I really had got a nasty mind, I would have gone to all the trouble I did. I would have just visited the women you read about on the boards of Paddington and Soho and done what I wanted. You can't buy happiness. I must have heard Aunt Annie say that 100 times. Haha, I always thought. Just let's have a try first. Well, I had my try. Because what it is, it's luck. It's like the pools. Worse, there aren't even good terms and bad terms and likely draws. You can't ever tell how it will turn out. Just A versus B, C versus D, and nobody knows what A and B and C and D are. That's why I never believed in God. I think they're just insects. We live a bit and then die, and that's the lot. There's no mercy in things. There's not even the great beyond. There's nothing. About 3 o'clock I dozed off, so I went up to get the last sleep. I lay in bed, seeing it all. The going into Lewis, when I woke up, coming back, having a bonfire, locking up, one last look at the collection, and then going down. She was waiting for me down there. I would say we were in love, in a letter to the police, a suicide pact. It would be the end. Part 4. As it happened, things turned out rather different. I didn't wake up until 10. It was another nice day. I had breakfast and then I went into Lewis and got the aspros and flowers and came back and went down, and then I thought I would just have a last look through the things. It was lucky I did. I found her diary, which shows she never loved me. She only thought of herself and the other man all the time. As it so happens, anyway, as soon as I woke up, I began to have more sensible ideas. It's just like me to see only the dark side last thing at night and wake up different. These ideas came a while as I was having breakfast. Not deliberate, they just came. About how I could get rid of the body. I thought if I wasn't going to die in a few hours, I could do this and that. I had a lot of ideas. I thought how I would like to prove it could be done. Nobody finding out. It was a lovely morning. The country around Lewis is very pretty. I also thought that I was acting as if I killed her, but she died, after all. A doctor probably could have done little good, in my opinion. It was too far gone. Another thing that morning in Lewis, it was a real coincidence. I was just driving to the flower shop when a girl in all an overall crossed the crossing where I stopped and let people over. For a moment, it gave me a turn. I thought I was seeing a ghost. She had the same hair, except it was not so long. I mean, she had the same size and the same way of walking as Miranda. I couldn't take my eyes off her, and I think I just had to park there, the car, and go back the way she was there. I had the good fortune to see her go into the Woolworths, where I followed and found she works behind the sweet counter. Well, I came back with the stuff and went down to see Miranda, to arrange the flowers, really. I could see I wasn't in the mood for the other thing. And I thought I had better think it over first, and then, in case I found the diary. The days passed. It is now 3 weeks since all that. Of course, I shall never have a guest again, although now Aunt Annie and Mabel have decided to stay down under. It would not be difficult. Still, as a matter of interest, I have since been looking into the problems there would be with a girl in Woolworth. She lives in a village the other side of Lewis from here, in a house a quarter-mile or so from the bus stop. You have to go along the country lane to get to it. As I say, it would be possible, if I hadn't learned my lesson. She isn't as pretty as Miranda, of course. In fact, she's only an ordinary common shop girl. But that was my mistake before, aiming too high. I ought to have seen that I could have never get what I wanted from someone like Miranda, with her all la-di-da ideas and clever tricks. I ought to have got someone who would respect me more, someone ordinary I could teach. She is in the box I made under the apple trees. I took the 3 days to dig the hole. I thought I would go mad the night I did it. Went down and got her in the box and made it outside. I don't think many could have done it. I did it scientific. I planned what had to be done and ignored my natural feelings. I couldn't stand the idea of having to look at her again. I once heard they go green and purple in patches, so I went with a cheap blanket and bought in front of me and held it out till I was by the bed, and then threw it over the deceased. I rolled it up and all the back clothes into the box, and soon had a lid screwed on. I got rolled the smell with fumigator and the fan. The room's cleaned out now and good as new. I shall put what she wrote and her hair up in the soft and deed box, which will not be opened till my death. So I don't expect for 40 or 50 years. I have not made up my mind about Marianne, another Anne. I heard the surveyors say that. This time, it won't be love. It will be just for the interest of the thing and to compare them, and also the other thing, which, as I say, I would like to go into in more detail and could teach her how. And the clothes would fit. Of course, I would make it clean from the start, who's boss and what I expect. But it is still just an idea. I only put the stove down there today because the room needs drying out anyway.